They found it where the segmentum's charts grew threadbare and the stars wore dust like old graves. Space there was not a void but a stillness, the way a pond stills after a drowning, flat as glass, reflective, hiding depth. The Omnissiah's whisper cut through that quiet like a scalpel, hull runes guttering, machine prayers thudding through her ribs. On the command pulpit, Magos biologist Ignar Thol stood sleepless and precise, a man whose heart had long ago traded its natural irregularities for metronomic grace. Range, Thol intoned. 3,600 kilometers, replied chanting Codapyra, voice filtered through a dozen purity codecs. Object mass registers as human manufacture, but alloys are unblessed. Unblessed was a polite word for unknown. The Mechanicus preferred not to say unknown. Unknowns offended the Omnissiah. Thol rotated 3 of his auxiliary eyes toward the void glass. The derelict drifted there, a silhouette darker than darkness, blocky prow, ribbed midsection, a tangle of gantries and cracked antennae. No aquila, no cog-toothed sigil. Along its flank, scorched letters lay like fossils. A different alphabet, angular, inelegant. A fragment caught the lumen. Open quote, SCP Foundation, Prometheus 3, close quote. Prometheus, Pyra murmured, tasting the syllables. Pre-compliance Terran dialect? Possibly, Thol said. His vox stripped the softness from words. The name matters less than the silence. No heat, no vox, no machine soul. Heretics said machines without souls were just tools. The Mechanicus knew better. Even a minor servitor hummed with presence. This hulk was mute. Muteness made Thol's augmetics itch. He drew the sign of the cog on his chest. Behind him, the choir servitors began the approach litany. Each utterance was clipped to the meter, praise the divine circuit. Bless the open port. Lumen strips dimmed in reverence. The whisper extended grapnels, and adamantine hooks kissed ancient armor with a sound like coins dropped in a mausoleum. Impact reverberated through the decks. The ship shivered. For a heartbeat, Thol felt the derelict answer, not with language, but with weight. A presence like a locked door. Seal the bite lines, Thol ordered. Prep the rites of safe entry, no picked feeds beyond passive shadows. We go in blind until the Omnissiah says otherwise. This was not caution, it was piety. The more ornate a device, the more carefully one approached its grievances, and this vessel was ornate in its absence of everything Thol expected to love. The first boarding team assembled in Bay Sanctum 4, 6 Skitarii in crimson, a pair of tri-limbed tech adepts, the chanting coder with her vox psalms cued, and Thol himself. He believed in being present at first contact. Delegation produced waste. Presence produced clarity. They crossed the docking tunnel as if walking a rope over a canyon. The pressurized umbilical groaned. Beyond the iris hatch yawned Prometheus 3, her atmosphere stale, her temperature slightly below human comfort, her corridors powdered with the thin frost that builds where no one exhales. Their boots made first prints in that powder. Thol listened to the sound. In healthy ships, the air subtly sang back, the hush of vents, the tick of heat, the life. Here, nothing. Just the clack of metal steps and the distant creak of structures cooling out of habit. They read the walls like scripture, panels they'd never seen, subconsoles like altar drawers, stenciled warnings in Terran script faded to ochre. Thol's smallest eye, mounted near his jaw, zoomed and collected glyphs. Record, he said, and Pyra's servo-scribes unfolded like silver spiders. In the first 10 minutes they found 2 rows of broken glass sarcophagi, containment cells perhaps. Within lay mummified suggestions, straps, cracked seals, something like a collar fused to a skeleton's neck. Each coffin bore a number and a brief label, almost all abraded to nonsense. But here and there a phrase breathed through the dust. Safe when wet. Proximity mimetic. No copper. Superstitious, sniffed one of the adepts. Specific, Thol corrected. Superstition lacks detail. They moved inward. The corridors narrowed, then widened with architectural whim, as if the ship had been built by committees that never spoke. Twice they passed through doorways whose frames were studded with dormant emitters. 3 times they saw impact scars in bulkheads shaped like hands, too large for man, too small for Astartes. Thol ran a finger along one crater. The metal there had crumpled, not melted. He said nothing. A side passage coughed up a shrine the size of a closet, not to the Omnissiah, but to a minimalist symbol, a circle, a line, a square nested. Offerings remained, a child's bead, a broken lens, a fishhook. The Mechanicus found comfort in universals. It let them believe in compatibility. Thol felt none. This shrine was wrong in a way he could not instrument. Margos, Pyrrha said quietly, we have a chamber ahead, something preserved, reading low energy, sealed atmosphere, intact seals. The lenses in Thol's skull turned as one. Proceed. They opened on a room made for looking. Platforms stepped down like theatre seating. Consoles ringed a central dais, and on that dais, embedded in caution tape and dead lumen, lay a single cryopod, armoured and clean, its viewing glass frost-misted from within. Above it, a crude placard had been bolted to a steel beam. The letters had been painted by hand, hurriedly, with a brush that splayed. Open quote, SCP-096. Do not view, close quote. The words were plain. That was what made them terrible. Not the archaic acronyms, not the forbidding tone. The plainness. Do not view. As if the thing inside were a cliff and men had gone over it anyway. Record, Thol said, more softly than he intended. Pyrrha began the rites for blind capture. These were not the Mechanicus' preferred methods. They were the methods for cursed things, for relics whose machine spirits demanded humility. They would illuminate the pod with frequencies that caress instead of interrogate, that sketch outlines without summoning the fury that a full spectrum invites. They would not look, not yet. They would listen with light. Even so, Thol felt the old hunger, human and shabby, knocking in his chest. Seeing is the root of understanding, and understanding is the root of praise. His mentors had burned that proverb into him so deeply that his scar tissue could recite it. He did not intend to disobey. He merely intended to understand the border so he could edge a toe across it later. Margos, said Censor Adept Hellion, a thin man with eyes like pinheads, I can cross-correlate the glyphs. Their alphabet uses positional redundancy. Likely translation would render the warning more idiot-proof. Do not make it clever, Thol said. Make it obedient. Hellion swallowed his sigh. He worked. The others circled the pod. Its edges were dented as if something had struck it from the inside, not enough to break, enough to bruise. The viewing pane was glossy with the last kiss of cold. Beneath the glass, Thol saw shapes like scaffolding and bands that had once been tight around a form. He did not see the form. Thermal? He asked. Pyrrha tilted her head, listening to the quiet. Low, stable. If there is biology, it is not thriving. If there is spirit, it is hiding. Good. Thol bowed to the glass, a tiny concession to fear, and began the opening catechism. By the will of the Omnissiah, may this vessel yield its secrets without harm. May that which is dangerous be bracketed. May that which is holy be heard. They hooked purity cables into legacy ports that were not made for them. They sang the binding of protocols to convince alien plugs that they were cousins. The pod's outer shell vibrated once, barely, like a sleeper turning. Frost ferned across the glass in a pattern too regular for accident, too organic for design. Filigree crawled outward from a central unseen node, a white flower blooming in negative. Stop, Thol said, without knowing why. The room held its breath. Somewhere in the ship, a hatch sighed, settling. The only living sound was the wet click of Pyrrha's tongue as she damped her lips before a verse. Thol's human eye, the leftmost, the least impressive, looked into that frost. He'd once been a boy who tracked ants along summer sidewalks. The human eye is a treacherous thing, it finds faces. There was a hint of one in the frost. Not an image, the suggestion of cheek, of a long oval, a shadow where eyes might be. He forced his gaze aside. No pict feeds, he said again, as if he hadn't already said it. Draft the blind archive. We will map silhouette and measure motion. No stills, no frames. Understood. They worked in layers. The data would produce a sculpted negative, the shape of the pod's interior described by the light that refused it. Thol occupied himself with logistics, chain of custody tokens, how many hours of air the boarding team had left, whether the Skitarii were growing twitchy. They were. They always did, away from hives. Void makes good soldiers imagine ghosts. Half an hour bled away. Hellion presented his translation on a flickering slate, its backlight kept to the warmth of candle flame. Open quote, designation 096. Do not look at its face. If exposure occurs, evacuate line of sight, terminate viewers. Containment method, physical barriers. No mirrors, no optics, no images. Do not view. Close quote. The words lay there, crude and absolute. Chirel. No, not Chirel. That came later. Thol wondered idly what sort of culture wrote warnings that were so functional. The Imperium painted its dangers with scripture, wrapped them in iconography until fear gilded into awe. This was workmanlike. It made him despise it a little less and fear it a little more. "Margos," Pyra said, "we have mapped the interior, bands, bracing, a cradle, no occupant silhouette resolves. If there is a body, it is masked by." The pod shuddered. It was a subtle tremor, like a sleeper exhaling after a dream. The frost lifted in a breath of glitter. Everyone flinched, except Thole, who had not forgotten how. He held still the way a hunting cat holds still at the rim of a garden. "Environmental equalization," Helion said too quickly, residuals crossing threshold. The pod shuddered again, louder. Metal ticked. Somewhere inside, pressure bled through a valve and made a faint, wet whimpering sound. No one moved for 2 heartbeats. "Back the team to the second ring," Thole said, voice even. "Do not draw weapons. Fear insults the machine." He inched forward. In the frost, the suggestion of a face had changed positions. Not much. Enough that his treacherous human eye believed in it more. Thole pressed his palm to the glass and whispered, "Be obedient." The pod answered with the smallest sound a throat can make. A hum. Not a machine hum. A living one, the kind a body produces when grief scales up into something there are no words for and must be bled out through tone. Under that hum, Thole felt the chamber's air thrum in sympathetic agreement. The servitors in the hall outside clicked their teeth. "Magos," Pyra said, "we need to." "Finish the blind archive," Thole said. "We will not surrender advantage because the vessel wishes to be theatrical. We are the Mechanicus." "We." The hum sharpened. Thole's palm vibrated on the glass. He removed it without ceremony. "My lord," Helion whispered, slate trembling in his hands, "there is a secondary annotation in smaller script I did not see. Read. Do not bring cameras, fools." The pod made a sound like a breath catching. "Shut down all capture," Thole said at once. "All of it. Every lumen, every passive. If it has eyes, let it find only darkness." He heard the relays thump. The room fell to the red hush of emergency light. The frost dimmed to a rusted mirror. For a moment, the ancient ship and the modern one whispered to each other through their joined cables, like old dogs touching noses. "Pyra," Thole said without looking away from the glass. "Send a crawl to the Whisper. No processing of any data packets from this chamber. Lock cipher. If anything renders an image, burn it. Sent." Thole let breath out of his lungs like a man trying not to fog a lens. "Good. Now we..." Something tapped from inside the pod. Just once. A knuckle on a coffin lid. The sort of sound you can explain as thermals until you hear it twice. They heard it twice. Tap, tap. Thole stepped back the way a swimmer steps out of a cold river, smoothly, without making a splash that might be mistaken for panic. He did not know fear as laymen do. He knew readiness. Readiness sang now along the racks of his spine. "Seal the room," he said. "We back away and we wait. This is a patient machine." He turned to leave. Behind him the pod sang. Not a note, a widening exhalation, a throat forced through a sound it had never been meant to use. The frost on the pane flowered into spirals. The air walked up their bones. Pyra's hand reached for his sleeve the way a child might, then stopped mid-reach, mortified to have almost called something human. "Magos," she whispered. "I hear it." He did not say, "I also feel it in the parts of me I have tried to outgrow." He did not say, "Some of us do not get to be children again when the world howls. Some of us must be wolves." He led them out, step by deliberate step, not taking his eyes from the pod until the last moment, because there exists in certain men an old compulsion. If something must be seen, let it be seen by me. They crossed the threshold. The iris hatch sighed shut, slicing the chamber into a memory. Thole set his hand against the door where the metal still held a whisper of warmth. "Return to the ship," he said. "We will fast. We will pray. We will let the ancient hurt inside that thing sleep again if it wishes." "And if it doesn't?" Helion asked, voice thin as wire. Thole considered the empty star field beyond the docking tunnel. He considered the way the derelict had carried its silence like a sacrament. He considered the tapping like fingers, precisely spaced. "If it does not," he said, and his voice was almost kind, "then we will give it nothing to see but our backs." They crossed the umbilical. Behind them, in the sealed room, something laid its palm against glass and began, very softly, to cry. On the third rotation, Thole convened his inner circle. Sensor-adept Helion's eyes flickered with the glow of active augments as he presented the preliminary translation. "Primitive Terran dialect, Magos. The script warns against..." Observation during access, possibly photosensitive systems in the specimen pod. I've begun a controlled scan. Thol inclined his head, the gesture of a man balancing faith and pride. Limited resolution only. Let the Omnissiah's light fall gently upon it. They worked from the Whisper's side of the docking umbilical, using remote cables threaded through the sealed bulkhead. Each cable carried one whisper of data back to their cogitators. Thermal noise, electromagnetic echo, spectral silence. The readings formed a shape without edges, the mathematical profile of absence. The algorithms called it void positive, something that absorbed every frequency thrown at it. The adepts misread this as evidence of heavy shielding. When Pyra suggested that void positive could indicate a living thing, they dismissed her as superstitious. Cold echoes. By the ship's 7th cycle, the derelict began to answer their curiosity in small, unsettling ways. The umbilical's hull sensors registered micro-impacts, 2 at a time, always 2. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. Pressure readings spiked for seconds, then fell back to normal. The Mechanicus logged it as thermal expansion. Yet every technician who went to check the clamps returned pale. I heard movement, one whispered, before being silenced. Something inside the hull, shifting. Thol forbade further superstition. Ships breathe, he told them. Metal remembers heat and movement. You hear its dreams. Still, he tripled the prayers during night cycle. Misinterpretation. Helion's persistence was both gift and curse. He had nearly finished decrypting a secondary data cache embedded in the pod's outer plate. Within that code, he found a string that repeated every few kilobytes, identical to the characters painted on the hull. He reported it to Thol, excitement trembling in his augmetic fingers. Its redundancy, a self-referential checksum, perhaps a visibility handshake for control systems. The term "do not view" may describe the connection method, not a warning. Then we must view to verify, Thol said without irony. He authorized a low-yield optical pulse, projected through the umbilical feed. The probe emitted a cone of blue light into the pod's frozen chamber. For 3 minutes, nothing answered but static. Then one sensor registered motion, fractional, rhythmic. A shift of internal mass, like a human chest rising once in breath. Helion smiled behind his mask. Functionality confirmed. The whimper. 18 minutes later, the ship's internal mics caught their first sound. It began faint, under the threshold of hearing, a vibration just above the resonance of human bone. The noise crawled through conduits and bulkheads until it reached the crew decks as a thin, high-pitched whimper. At first they blamed the ventilation fans, then the grav coil alignment. But the sound persisted, rising and falling in slow, painful cadence. Pyra approached Thol during the 12th recurrence. "Magos," she said softly, "the noise carries harmonic pattern consistent with vocal distress." He turned one of his lenses toward her. Machines lament when woken before calibration. The old ones cry longer. Still, he felt something twist in the carbon lining of his gut. The fault in the logic. By second shift, all lower decks reported structural tremors, faint but spreading outward from the umbilical. Readouts showed no pressure differential, no mechanical cause. Only impact stress, periodic and precise. Tap, 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 tap. Always pairs, always growing louder. Crew began refusing rotations near the junction. They claimed the noise changed when they spoke, as if listening. Thol ordered a full lockdown and set the area to sanctified isolation. To soothe his own nerves, he reviewed Helion's latest translation updates. The adept had rendered the phrase in High Gothic now. Open quote, "Do not observe without control measures." Close quote. It sounded bureaucratic, harmless. Thol nodded approval. The pressure builds. Late that cycle, as the ship drifted in false night, every lumen dimmed at once. Vox channels burst into white hiss. From the umbilical came a long, low groan, the steel equivalent of breath drawn through teeth. Pyra was the first to move. "Pressure surge in the docking bay." Before Thol could answer, the floor shook under a concussive blow. Alarms screamed. Readouts flashed red across the hololith. External force, contact pattern, non-mechanical, magnitude rising. The Mago steadied himself against the rail. Through the vibrations he felt the rhythm, a sequence of impacts, each more violent than the last. The sound of bare hands meeting armor plate. He issued orders in the calm monotone of ritual. Seal all visual sensors, cut every optical feed to the umbilical, disconnect external power. The last command severed the probe's link, but not before it transmitted a final image packet, a corrupted frame that none yet realized contained a face. The transfer daemon cued it automatically for data repair. The system waited, processing, rendering. In the silence that followed, the impact ceased. For a moment, the ship exhaled relief. Then came the faintest noise, muffled by meters of metal, yet unmistakably human. A soft sob, drawn out like a breath, trying not to exist. The sound of something that had just realized it had been seen. End of Chapter 2. This version fixes the logic. They misread the warning entirely. No one truly hears 096 speak, only environmental sounds that build toward the whimper. The first inadvertent image capture occurs here, but isn't displayed yet. That happens in Chapter 3. The chapter ends on 096's canonical pre-rampage sob, signaling that the trigger event has just occurred. Do not view the repair daemon completed its task at 4:23 ship time. A single corrupted frame, buried deep within the archive cache, was reconstructed and marked stable. It lasted less than a heartbeat. The ship's system, efficient and blind, distributed the file to mirrored drives across 7 decks for redundancy. For 0.2 seconds, the image displayed on a maintenance repeater. No one saw it with human eyes, but the ship did, and the ship had many eyes. The whimper. In the umbilical, all motion stopped. The air seemed to pull tight. Then, faintly, from behind meters of sealed steel, came a soft, broken sound. A single trembling whimper. It was the kind of noise made when grief has no mouth but still demands to be heard. The sound crawled through the ship's hull like cold water through cracks, resonating in ducts, vents, and rails. Crew stopped mid-task. Servitors froze mid-motion. Every man and woman aboard felt it, without knowing why. Pyra was first to speak, her voice hushed. "Muggos! The sound. It's coming through the hull." Thol said nothing. He stood very still, listening. He knew something had gone wrong. On Deck 7, Adept Loris watched the archive repeater flicker. He saw nothing, only static and faint light, but for some reason his pulse began to race. He rubbed his eyes, blamed exhaustion, and went back to work. Behind the walls, something breathed. Once, twice. The air vents flexed as if exhaling. Then came another whimper, longer now, mournful. The scream. It began without warning. A single, impossible note, so loud it was almost silent, ripped through the whisper's hull and into the bones of every living soul aboard. It wasn't heard, it was felt. Teeth vibrated in jaws, blood shook in veins, metal screamed in sympathy. The sound was pure despair turned physical. Lights shattered, vox lines burst into static, pressure doors slammed on reflex. Then the impacts began. The first blow dented the docking collar. The second caved it in. The third broke through. The umbilical tunnel imploded like a tin can. Bolts tore free. Steel screamed. Then came the unmistakable sound of bare hands against metal. Again and again and again. The thing inside wasn't passing through walls. It was breaking them. The break, Loris never saw it clearly. He only heard the wall behind him deform, like something breathing against it. Then the panel burst inward, and everything in front of him, light, air, thought, became movement. It hit him faster than he could even scream. Across the ship, the same story unfolded in a dozen different rooms. The sound of impact, followed by nothing. Bulkheads folded like paper, pipes ruptured, bodies vanished into motion. It wasn't a battle. It was physics obeying something stronger than itself. 096 moved too fast to see, too strong to understand. Every wall between it and its witnesses was simply gone. The whisper convulsed as its decks tore apart in sequence, one after another, each blow punctuated by that endless, soul-ripping scream. And still the sound didn't fade. It deepened. It wasn't rage. It was sorrow weaponized. Orders Thol gripped the command rail as alarms screamed around him. All optical systems, purge them! Now! Every lens, every screen. Pyra obeyed. She initiated the blindness protocol. Helm visors went dark. Cameras fused their lenses. Auspex arrays folded their arms like dying flowers. But it was too late. The creature had already found those who had seen the frame. It knew where they were. It always knew. The corridor. It hit Deck 8 next. The first strike made the bulkhead bow outward. The second punched straight through, spraying shards of adamantium like glass. Ascatarius stood his ground, weapon raised. He fired a shock blast that would have stopped a charging Ogrin. It slowed the creature for less than a blink. 096 reached him. There was no second shot, only the sound of armor tearing and metal bending. The scream didn't pause. It didn't care. It couldn't. It moved on. Everywhere it went, walls crumpled inward like tinfoil, hallways collapsed, air ignited from friction. The crew ran, but running only delayed inevitability. Some never even saw it. They died hearing it, their eardrums ruptured, lungs imploding from the sheer force of its passage. The reactor path, Thol watched the deck readings spike, each impact closer, faster, stronger. He didn't pray. He calculated. "Open a path," he said. Pyra looked at him, confused. "Magos? Don't trap it. Direct it, guide it to the reactor. That's the only space big enough to survive contact." She hesitated, then nodded and began unlocking bulkheads in sequence, shaping a single corridor of retreat, straight into the sanctum at the ship's heart. The Whisper obeyed its masters one last time. Doors opened, lights turned green, a highway of death was cleared. The last stand. One of the Whisper's armored wardens remained near the sanctum entrance. His name would never be recorded. He waited with a detonator in hand, armor cracked, visor dark. The corridor ahead of him pulsed with noise, each impact shaking dust from the rafters. Then, silence. A pause so sharp it hurt. He breathed once. The wall ahead exploded. A blur of pale limbs and blooded steel slammed into him like a meteor. He brought his weapon down, aiming for its head. It didn't matter. The hit connected, but the force that came back broke his arm before the blow even landed. He fell. It ran through him, past him, toward the light of the reactor beyond. He had bought exactly 3 seconds. Thol used them. The end of the Whisper. An 096 entered the sanctum at full velocity. Wards flared and disintegrated. Ceramite rails snapped. The floor buckled. It hit the reactor housing. A shell built to survive a direct lance strike and tore through half of it. Plasma containment screamed. Energy flooded the air in blue arcs that painted the creature's skin like lightning. It didn't stop. It couldn't stop. "Now!" Thol shouted. He pulled the translation lever. The ship lurched, folding into the edge of the warp. The walls stretched and blurred. Every sound became a vertical line of static. Space tried to swallow itself. 096 kept running. It struck the reactor core as reality split. The light went white, then blue, then nothing. When the Whisper returned, half of it didn't. The rear decks existed in a state of suspension, edges half-turned into geometry that refused to end. The reactor was sealed inside a silent glow. Silence, Thol stood in what remained of the command sanctum. His instruments were dead. Pyra sat against the wall, bleeding from the nose, whispering machine prayers through broken teeth. Then, faintly, through the quiet, came a sound. A dull, heavy thud. A pause. Another thud. Something was still there. Something trapped between here and whatever place the warp had refused, pounding, patient, endless. Thol lowered his head. "Find out how many minutes we bought," he said softly. "Make them count." He turned toward the sound, the slow, deliberate rhythm echoing through metal and eternity. Thud, pause, thud, pause, thud. And the stars outside flickered, as if afraid to watch any longer. For a long time there was no sound at all. Not silence exactly. Silence is full of small things, but a suspension, as if the ship had been placed beneath glass and the universe had stepped back to watch. Thol felt it first in his teeth, the faint buzz of machinery trying to remember that it was real. His optics were dead. The implants behind his eyes had burned themselves out when space folded. He saw only the ghost of light that lived inside pain. He moved anyway. The deck beneath him rippled when he shifted his weight. It was not metal any longer, but something that pretended to be. It held, grudgingly. Pyra. No answer. He turned toward the last place her voice had lived. A shape crouched there. Her crimson robes turned the color of old rust. Her breathing came in quick, frightened bursts, each one pulling a tiny trail of vapor into the freezing air. "Magos," she whispered, and that single word seemed to break whatever spell kept the ship from noticing its own damage. Somewhere deep inside the hull, the first creak announced gravity's slow return. Then came the thud, distant, deliberate, patient. Thud, pause, thud, the rhythm of something that refused to stop. The waking ship systems began to stir. Status runes blinked uncertainly, flickering between languages as though unsure which reality they belonged to. Air scrubbers coughed again, and began to move the same air in slow circles. Pyra tried to stand and failed twice before finding balance. "We did it." Thol's laugh was a thin static burst. We bought time. That's all containment ever is. He moved to the main console. Half of it was missing, the rest twisted into a shallow spiral, but the input studs still recognized his touch. One by one, he coaxed sensors awake. The Whisper's mind came back in pieces. Decks 7 through 9, gone. Power cores, stable. External hull, partially fused with another geometry, undefined material, undefined coordinates. He didn't read it aloud. There was no vocabulary for what half the ship had become. The thudding continued, steady as a heartbeat. He traced it across the schematic, reactor chamber. Same location as before. Pyra looked toward the sound. Still there. Yes. Trying to get out? No. He paused, trying to finish. The corridor of ghosts. They moved through the upper decks together. The corridors that had survived were warped, their lines wrong in subtle ways that made the eyes ache. Here and there the ship showed flashes of its other self, walls half-transparent, glimpses of colour that didn't exist in normal spectra. In those brief openings, Thol thought he saw motion, a pale blur pacing just beyond reach. The air was cold enough to burn. Each breath crystallized and fell as powder. The lumen strips no longer shone. They pulsed faintly like slow heartbeats. They passed what had been a Skitarius once. Only the armor remained, embedded upright in a wall like a fossil. The metal around it had flowed, frozen mid-wave. Pyra stopped beside it. He stood here. Thol laid a hand on the frozen pauldron. Then he's still standing. Neither of them said the word dead. There was no need. The ship was a tomb, and tombs understood respect, the Sanctum. When they reached the reactor Sanctum, the doors were gone. In their place hung a shimmering plane, as thin as a soap bubble, humming at a pitch just below hearing. Beyond it lay the chamber, half there, half not. The central floor was warped inward around the core, forming a shallow bowl of fused metal and light. At the bottom of that bowl, something moved. Not fluidly, more like an idea struggling to remember what motion should look like. A figure, tall, thin, head bowed, hands at its sides. The skin, if it was skin, shone like porcelain seen through smoke. It was standing in the same posture the cryopod had recorded, as though nothing had changed, except that now it wept. The sound was faint, irregular, carried through the hull rather than air. Every sob vibrated through the plates underfoot. Pyra whispered, "It's trapped." Thol nodded, between what was and what should be. Another thud shook the deck. The figure struck the invisible boundary, recoiled, struck again. No rage, just compulsion. Thud, thud. "It will never stop," Pyra said. "No." Thol's voice was quieter than the hum of the barrier. "It doesn't know how." Recording the unrecordable Thenil, he activated a single servo quill from his belt and let it etch data onto a strip of parchment. Not a pict, not a hollow, just text. Open quote, observation, entity 096, contained by spatial fracture. Behavior, cyclical aggression followed by lamentation. Termination, impossible. Recommendation, abandon vessel. Quarantine orbit, prey. Close quote. He sealed the parchment with his blood and fed it into a drone cylinder. The tiny machine took the file, hummed a scent, and vanished into a maintenance duct that led to the surface beacon. If the beacon survived, someone would find it. If not, then the words would drift forever, the way confessions do when they are too late. They made their way to the surviving shuttle cradle. Only one craft remained intact. Barely. The rest had melted into the hull or into one another. Pyra began the ignition litanies while Thol watched the reactor door. The pounding never faltered. As the shuttle detached, the view through the forward ports showed the Whisper suspended above a dead world. Half of her was real, half shimmered in frozen distortion. Lightning crawled across her skin, feeding into the breach where reality folded inward. Pyra stared. Will it stay like that? Yes. Thol's tone held no triumph. That is what a cage looks like when it forgets what shape it was built to be. The message. When they reached safe distance, Thol activated the emergency Vox relay. Its range was pitiful, but it would scream into the void until someone heard. "This is Magos Biologist Ignar Thol of the Omnissiah's Whisper. Containment event complete. Vessel compromised. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. The anomaly remains active. Designation unknown. It cannot be destroyed. We have achieved partial stillness." He stopped there, unable to finish the prayer. The relay clicked off and continued broadcasting without him. Behind the shuttle, the Whisper turned slowly, one half glinting with the hard light of real space, the other drowning in shimmer. At her heart, the pounding carried on, rhythmic, patient, and eternal. Thud, thud. The last words of Magos. Thole hours later, as Pira dozed in the co-pilot's chair, Thole recorded a final log for any who might find them. Containment is a matter of endurance, not victory. We built walls and called them faith. The thing we woke knows no such words. It runs still in its little piece of forever, chasing every eye that dared to look. If you find this ship, blind yourselves. If you hear the pounding, pray that it never stops. Because when it stops, it means it has found a way through. He ended the recording and stared at the dead planet below. The stars beyond it blinked like tired witnesses. In the black between them, something vast and pale moved for a moment, then was gone.
2 months after the translation jump, the dead world had grown a new constellation of machines. Recovery habs ringed the wreck of the Omnissiah's whisper. Trenches cut the sand like the furrows of a field. Servo masts blinked red and gave mottled light to faces that did not need to be seen to be afraid. Inquisitor Ardent Tyrell watched the sight from the tower. The feedback on his ear was a thin pulse of something the Vox could not name. It had been there since they'd arrived, a low animal timing that everyone pretended not to notice. Pretending did not make it honest. "Magos teams clearing the Sanctum," the Vox officer said. "Grey Knights on overwatch. Guard perimeter at hold." "Good," Tyrell said, and the word fell like a practiced stone. He walked out into the wind. The reactor sanctum yawned like a mouth that had lost its teeth. Half the door was a shimmer, the rest a hole where geometry refused to finish itself. In the center of the bowl, the figure knelt. Tall, pale, the posture of a thing that does not choose prayer but follows a program. Tech priests trussed around with clamps and chains and chants. Brother Captain Galvar and his grey knights stood arrayed in shadow, halberds at rest, visors dark. They worked with the caution of men moving near a sleeping god. The plan was simple and ugly. Insert a containment shroud, seal the sanctum, cart the thing away to a black vault no man would visit. The world had a short memory for the wrong things. They wanted this wrong thing to be lost inside it. No one meant to see its face. No one meant for the first image to be shared. A picked servitor, idle under a tarpaulin, woke to the sound of cutters and lights. Its optic flicked on. Somewhere in a logistics tent, a tech adept named Seran checked the camp net on a hand console. Routine, procedural. The servitors still appeared on his mirror for a fraction of a second. A reflection in the glass of a torn pauldron's shard, and inside that reflection a suggestion of an oval, a pair of dark hollows. He did not know what he looked at. He only saw a shape like a face, and the curiosity that does not yet know how to be careful caught him. Saran glanced away, rubbed his eyes, then looked again. Authority told him to log the still. Habit told him to share it with his team. A single frame went across the net. Across the field, a maintenance tech, Laurus, who had kept the archive room in the Whisper and never fully recovered the look he'd caught inside the repeater, saw the image on the net as it propagated. He leaned over a crate, blinked, and the shape of a face slid wrong into the hollow of his head. That was the first true witness in the camp. The servitor had done its job, the ship had seen, and the camp had been marked. In the sanctum, the kneeling shape inhaled. The sound moved along the hull and became something small and terrible. A whimper. It traveled through conduits, through sand, through the thin membranes of men's attention until it found Saran in a tent and Laurus in a hut and a tech priest at the cutter rig. They all stopped at once, breath trapped, one by one. For a breath they did not know was about to belong to them. The world paused. Then everything answered. The scream arrived as if weather. It struck the camp with the weight of a falling sky and the precision of a blade. Air folded, tents flattened, Vox towers popped and fell into themselves like candles given to wind. The sound was horror given a shape. It was not merely loud, it was directive. It told the body what to do, and the body obeyed by breaking. The figure in the bowl did not run. It moved with the inevitable certainty of a thing set to an axis. There is a last witness, and there exists only the shortest path to it. 096's target list was simple because the world had already annotated it. The net had recorded the image in order. The list read like a ledger. First, Laurus, Maintenance, Archive 7. He had seen the static smear on the repeater and had not known to burn his own eyes. Second, Saran, the tech adept who forwarded the frame to his team. Third, the cutter crew who had lingered at the Sanctum's lip and watched the shimmer tear. Then, a string of guardsmen and engineers who had glanced at the camp feeds, the medic who had checked the repeater bad sector, the Grey Knight who, for a breath, let a visor flicker as he adjusted a ward. 096 did not calculate. It did not hesitate. It obeyed the architecture of procurement. Witness, vector, termination. It struck in the order the witnesses had been recorded, one by one, smashing everything between itself and each person in turn. It reached Loris first. Loris was at a generator clamp, trying to reset a fuse the scream had blown. He had not known he had been seen by the servitor. He did not have time to understand why the panel behind him bowed and bulged. The metal peeled like a banana and left a gap the thing exploited like an answer to a question. Loris had the advantage of surprise for the length of a heartbeat. That heartbeat did not include a chance to run. The thing struck his position, shoulder first, with the violent relative motion of a car hitting a fence. The generator bent away. Loris's shout was a note cut off. The thing moved past him before the men who ran to help had closed the distance. By the time they reached the scene, there was only the echo of a body being removed from a world. The scream cut on and then dimmed, satisfied for that instant. It kept a ledger and marched to Siran next. Siran had been farther from the Sanctum, under a canvas that had become a map of the camp. He'd never left the console after forwarding the frame. He had sat in the glow and argued with an able hand about permissions. When the scream hit his tent, it came like a hand falling. He staggered upright and ran. The thing arrived with the speed of a falling tree. It took the line between him and the nearest exit, and with the same unstoppable force it used to break through the whisper, it cleaved a hole through canvas and trench and men. Siran's team raised weapons. The sound of bolts spitting was immediate, thunderous, but the thing did not stop for projectiles the way creatures of lower constitution do. Bolter slugs punched into it and blew meat back from bone. It staggered, corrected. It moved on. The cutter crew were next, men working the shroud and the clamps. They had edged so close to the shimmer that they had forgotten their hands were meant to be tools and not eyes. One by one, the sound peeled them from existence. Snap, motion, absence. Where one man had been, only a gap and a rag of fabric remained. The scream reared at each new witness and pushed at the edges until the thing had the straightest path to the next name on the list. The sequence widened. Medics, a logistics sergeant, and xenosologist who had stepped out of curiosity, a pair of servitors whose optics had mirrored back the image in the corner of a lens. Each target had some small mechanical tie to the initial image propagation. Each had been a node in the chain that became the ledger. The thing erased them in the order the ledger demanded. It did not hunt by scent or sound alone. It moved along the annotated wire of recorded sight. When it crossed the trench line and met the guardsmen, the battlefield changed. The Grey Knights squared and the guardsmen unclipped belts and took their men's shoulders. Someone attempted to form a firing line. Someone else attempted to fall back. Doctrine moved like a slow animal across the sand. The thing moved like weather. Bolter volleys cut into it, and large-caliber rounds tore flesh from frame. The wounds were ugly and honest. They were answers to force. Bone flashed like white under rain. It did not stay white. Tissue grew back as if stitched by an angry hand. Where one impact carved a hole, 3 became a seam, and 10 became flesh again. Autocannons 500 meters away blasted lines into its flank. Lascannons left clever holes that Smoky Blue tried to claim. Shells of heavy weaponry detonated nearby and threw it airborne in arcs that would have crushed lesser beasts. It rose, reeled, then adjusted and landed as if nothing had been done. When it hit a knight, Brother Captain Galvar, it was not tactical. The knight had not been on the original witness list, but he had looked, for the smallest of moments, toward the shimmer as the figure rose in the bowl. That little misstep placed him in the ledger. He would be a mark. Galvar met it with halberd and creed, and the two of them exchanged the physics of absolute things. Bolter Spatter opened a quarter face, and the knight's weapon found purchase on a shoulder. The knight was flung. He found himself a measure of distance away, with armor cracked and breath gone. But he rose because Grey Knights are a sequence built to continue where other men stop. The thing did not stop for his rise. It kept the ledger. It found a path that brought it to the next named witness and tore through a line of men who tried to be barriers. Each kill read like a thin checkbox. Witness. Terminated. The creature paid no heed to names or ranks. It only erased observation. It did not gloat. It did not slow to loot. It ran on the backbone of compulsion. As it crossed the field, its healing was visible to those too stunned to look away. Rips in flesh closed into taut new skin in seconds. Where a bolter had opened a face to bone, pink braided over bone in a handful of breaths. Where less cannon had cleared daylight through ribs, muscle crawled back over the frame until the frame wore itself again with the patience of inevitability. Tanks pivoted, saved men by mass, but even mass could be redirected. A Lehman Russ fired a round that sent the thing airborne. It landed and ran, muscles knitting in the arc between impact and ground. Guardsmen who believed in lines found out the wrongness of lines. Containment depends on a world that can be kept still. 096 runs when a world refuses stillness. It moved faster than doctrine could recalibrate. Where soldiers aimed, they aimed at the moment that had been, and not at the movement that was. 96's speed bent the perception of time for the people who watched. It was first a blur, then a shape, then a hole where form used to be, and finally a small silence for those who had been the latest witnesses. When it struck the med tent, the noise climbed to its highest arc, the scream a living chord, and men in triage fell with tools still in their hands. The medics it touched had been in that tent because, moments earlier, they had moved to check a link. They had looked at a screen that had shown the faint smudge. They were on the ledger. It took them as if someone had plucked fruit from branches, clean and terrible, leaving nothing but the memory of weight. And then, after the list had been exhausted, after the servitor, the tech priest, the cutter crew, the medics, the sergeants, the guardsmen, the knight who had glanced, the thing did the only thing it ever does. It crumpled, it sank to its knees in the crater it had made with all the generosity of weather and covered its face with its hands. The motion was small, human in the worst possible way. The sound that came then was not the scream, but the thin, brittle sob cataclysm can teach. It did not last long. Men who had not died watched because watching felt like understanding, and understanding is the lie people use to keep living. When the sobbing stopped, new tissue already smoothed the surfaces that had become torn. The thing was whole again in minutes, no trophies on its person, no pieces of those it had removed. The crater smelled like metal and sand, and something else that never learned to be clean. Tyrell stood on the lip of the rim, sand stitching his boots to the earth, and counted a number of men he had seen that would never be whole again. He spoke into a vox that had to be kept honest with commands. "Exterminatus minor," he said. "Purge the site. Purge the net. Null all data. No records, no relics. Anyone who saw, mark them. We will not allow survivors to keep their sight. They must be laid to rest. Mark them?" the Vox officer asked, voice small. Tyrell's eyes did not leave the kneeling shape. Marked for euthanasia, for mercy, for the security of the many. The officer did not ask what mercy tasted like when mixed with necessity. He only repeated the order. Men moved like slow things to the task. Doctrine had teeth when fed by fear. Orders went down the lines, men who had glimpsed the frame, or who had been close enough to have a mirror show it, or who had adjusted their visor at the wrong time were identified. Some of them begged, some refused to believe, some were too stunned to speak. The Inquisition kept a thin list and a thicker silence. The camp became a place of checks, whose eyes had seen, whose hands had shared, whose servitor had mirrored, whose console had forwarded, whose face had been printed on the net. Each name on the ledger became a small instruction of death. The punishing guns came down out of the sky with the quiet finality of state decisions. They did not scream, they executed. The site was cleansed. Heat walked across sand, glass cracked as it cooled, data lines were scrapped, drives smashed, memory banks wiped with a ceremonial precision that would read like ritual to the pious and like cruelty to the rest. Those who had looked were given brief intervals of grace. Then, in quiet clusters, they were taken aside and put to sleep by hands trained to be clean. The thing in the crater did not watch. It had no hate in it to direct at those whose lives ended because they saw it. It simply sat with its face in its hands until the men with the orders were gone and only wind and ruined banners remained. Then, because it always does what it does, it rose and walked away from the crater, not because it fled, but because walking is the only motion it comprehends. On the official record, the site would later be a burned circle and a short list of names. The Inquisition would call the action necessary. The Mechanicus would call the loss a measured sacrifice. Men in trenches would count their friends and find that the count had been reduced to a new set of numbers. Some would sleep and not dream. Others would wake from dreams with a face behind their eyes and not know what to do but live. Above the camp, the banner of the Inquisition trapped sand in its folds, and the stars watched as they always did, distant, indifferent, incapable of learning. The Pale Saint of Silence was a name the men would whisper and then try to forget, until the day someone forgot to forget. The ledger had been obeyed. The hunting had been beautiful in its own mechanical way. The world paid. The marks were taken off the list 2 different ways, by the creature's motion and by the Inquisition's mercy. In the days to come, Tyrell would sign papers and send men to places where eyes could be closed forever and quietly. He would watch the archive doors lock with a satisfaction that tasted of ash. He would see half a ship hanging across a dead horizon until the whisper stitched and unstitched itself like a wound that refused to heal, and in the crater for a little while, the thing sat with its head in its hands and made the small noises of a creature that ends only when the ledger runs dry. The world smouldered like a coal that had forgotten it was once a forest. Heat lived under the glass in long, sleeping rivers. Wind moved and the rivers cracked, a brittle music that went on for hours at a time, thin and relentless, the kind of sound that sands a memory down to its simplest edges. Above that ruin, the ships of the Inquisition drew patient ellipses and wrote a geometry of ownership across the sky. Men put names on what they feared so that fear would sit still, and the orbit they chose took a name: the Pale Halo. From a tower of prefabricated plates, whose seams never stopped ticking, Inquisitor Ardent Tyrell watched the surface through a pane that was not glass and did not reflect. The pane showed a wasteland the way a priest shows a wound to a penitent. Look, understand, do not turn away. The burn lines from Exterminatus ran in cords to the horizon. Every trench was a trench again, not a place where men had waited, but a line where heat had decided to live for a few minutes longer than its neighbors. The wreck of the Omnissiah's Whisper lay half buried at a tilt, one half honest metal, the other half a shimmer that made the eye doubt itself. Even now, weeks after the guns had gone quiet, the shimmer twitched as if it were attempting to remember a shape it had not earned. Tyrell had learned that endings felt like work. The ones worth anything never felt like victory. What lay on that world was an ending, and there was work. He descended the tower. The stairwell breathed cold into his coat and smelled of oil. Every step clicked the way industrial steps click when they have not yet decided they are permanent. Outside, a line of adepts and labor servitors waited on the lee side of a ridge that heat had turned into glass, their red robes grit-streaked, their heads bent not in humility, but from the weight of too much augury. Magos Dominus Ignar Thol stood among them, lighter by an arm and an eye since the ship, heavier by iron. The 2 of them did not speak in the way lesser men would have. Words had long since become a private ritual. Between them lay a ledger of decisions and their prices, and they knew what could be bought and what could not. Tyrell gave the smallest tilt of his head. Thol answered with breath pulled through augmetic filters. This was the shape of assent, a blueprint passed from one hand to another, a decision that had already been made. They began with the horizon. Ships from the Ordo Malleus seeded the thin sky with scaffolds that unfolded like clever insects and drank the meager light for power. The first pylons found their holds in the bedrock. The second ring knitted to the first. The third ring hung its weight from the second and took on mass. The fourth ring hid itself within the third, the way a secret hides under a sentence. The fortress in orbit was not beautiful. It had no lines to flatter the eye, no banners to tempt pride. It was a shape meant to erase reflections, a husk with a heart of subtraction. Plating went on in squares, dull and flat. Weld lines were scrubbed with a black paste that drank any light foolish enough to touch it. Vents were baffled, ports turned inward, seams folded until they were not seams. There was a discipline against shine. The station swallowed its own silhouette. The labor was the kind that turns men into liturgy. Blind servitors moved along the hull in harnesses, their hands guided by a single monofilament that ran the perimeter. They did not watch each other's footing because none of them had eyes to watch with. They moved by count and touch. Hearing went next for some of them. Thol took it without apology. Sound was a wire the universe might pluck if given the chance. A team would finish a run, clip in, pass the cable along to a team that had not heard silence yet, then stand in a line against a wall while a mechadendrite threaded tiny red beads of wax into their ear canals that hardened into order. Their lips still moved with old prayers. Their hands learned a new language of taps and pressure. On the 6th day, a shuttle came in too hot and bent a gantry. It was mended in hours without commentary. On the 9th day, a sky squall threw dust, and the dust carried a memory of the scream that made a few of the younger men look sharply at nothing and press the heel of their hands to their teeth. No one told them not to. The wind ran out of everything and went back to being wind again. Tyrell slept in the hour gaps machine schedules left for men, never at the same time twice. Thol did not sleep so much as power down parts of himself in sequence. When he woke in action, palms already in contact with the next rivet pattern, the next purity seal, the next page of a book that had learned not to hold words. Work called down the horizon until the horizon answered with a feeling like balance. The station had a spine. The spine had ribs. At the end of each rib, a muscle the color of old night clenched and then relaxed, and the ring of it made a sound like an exhale from a patient who has finally decided to live. They built the box inside the station the way men once dug wells. The outer shells went first, 9 plates thick, each plate a different metal, each metal an argument against a different sin. The inside was a cube that made the throat feel narrow to think of, 20 meters aside, walls lined with a cloth Thol had woven from lead and faith. No bright molecules lived there. No lumens, no diodes, no polished anything. There was a floor smooth enough for a child to crawl on without barking knees, though no child would ever crawl there. There was what might have been a chair before Thol looked at it and called it a mistake. The thing was removed and the floor was polished where it had been until it forgot a shape had ever stood in that place. Around the cube, a veil. Null glass learned from experiments men had buried and promised never to remember. It did not reflect. It unhappened reflection. Light that touched it became a little colder and a little less certain of itself and lost heart and sat down. Men asked whether gates were wise. Tyrell told them a truth. Gates are for visitors. The cube had no visitors. Entrance would be a one-time conversation with consequence, not a door that learned bad habits. A single seam was carved for a single sarcophagus. After that, the wall would be itself again, and not a seam. There was doctrine to draft while the welders spoke their long, bright language. The doctrine had shape in Tyrell's head, a set of laws as plain as a road sign and as unarguable as gravity. No image of the thing would be made again. No words describing it would survive in any medium that could be shared without breath warming a listener's ear. Wardens would be blind by oath and surgery, servants by vocation and wound. The bolt shells of the knights would be polished to dullness and wrapped until it was time to unwrap them. Voxes would be stripped down to channel static and code. If a voice needed to go somewhere, it would go with a human to carry it, and the human would be known by name to the one who received them. It was a law of subtraction. Take away anything that might become a mirror. The universe would sit in the corner. Curiosity would learn manners. Thol kept a ledger on parchment, not because he was nostalgic, but because parchment wears out in hands and ash, and in the end it remembers too much of where it has been to be useful to anyone else. He wrote with a needle-fine quill. The pages were thin as light. He did not think of the boy he had been, who would have persisted in finding a face in every frost pattern. That boy had good eyes. The man had learned that eyesight is a trap. On the surface, the sarcophagus waited. It had been dragged miles out of the bowl where the sound had ended, inch by inch on skates that had scorched the glass. When a track broke, 24 men cradled the weight until it could be mended. It was not heavy the way machines are heavy. It was heavy the way a promise is heavy. 60 hands moved it, and every hand, after the day's shift, stank of wax and oil, and a breath beneath breath that had nothing to do with lungs. The box around the thing had no decoration. Its face had a grain to it where a factory's rollers had pushed and pressed with even love. 12 seals circled the rim of the lid like months around a year. Between them, grooves meant for instruments whose names had been killed. Inside, a smaller darkness lived with a patience that had intimidated fear itself into silence. They brought the crane in on the 33rd day, when the glass had finally cooled enough to take the footings of the pylon legs. The crane had cables that spoke when they took weight, a low music of strained wire. Men in harnesses climbed and made the sign of the cog with their thumbs against the webbing of the palms, because habit travels with a hand whether a man wants it to or not. Tyrell stood to one side, coat drawn tight, one hand at his back at the small pain that never left since the whisper, the other folded at his breastbone like a prayer that had learned to hide. The crane kissed the mounting lugs. The world bowed half a degree under the weight, and then unbowed. The cables took the strain and wrote it into the tower. The tower spoke to the ground, and the ground answered by remembering how to be ground. One word went out, and that word had no sound. Raise. The sarcophagus lifted. Glass pebbled under the skates as they lost contact. Dust trickled from grooves and caught light that was not from a sun. The face of the box looked almost warm for an instant. It was a lie made by friction. Cold returned and sat on it like a king. 100 meters, 200, 5. Wind came and tried to describe what was happening and failed, then tried again because wind is patient and force is its dialect. Inside the crane, a man watched needles on a panel that had been stripped of every reflective element. He could not see the thing he was lifting. He could feel the story through the tilt and sway. He spoke in numbers the way monks speak in psalms, one long remembered chant of tolerances and allowed oscillations and limits that must not be exceeded. The numbers steadied, the box rose. Under the skin of the sky, transports took their places like old birds committing to a current. The one chosen to carry the weight had ribs that had been sanded dull. Its decks had been painted with a paint that refused to shine. Its lamps were turned as low as a hand could work by. The men who would ride it were already blind behind their visors. It was the kind of ship that does not know it is a ship because it has never been asked to be anything else but a container. When the box cleared the ridge, the first tremor came. It was not dramatic. Silent behavior had taught men to expect thunder when a thing mattered, but the world did not shout any longer. Through the cables, Thol felt it, a weight shifting inside a larger weight, a small change in distribution, the whisper memory of a thing drawing breath. Someone said a word that was not a prayer and corrected it with a prayer that was not a word. The crane never faltered. The cables learned a new song. Tyrell tasted copper and told his mouth to pretend it was wind. Halfway to the docking cradle, the smallest sound wandered up the metal and along the spine of the tower. It had to travel so far that by the time it reached a human ear, it had forgotten what it had been called. It arrived anyway, a broken little note, almost polite, a whimper the size of a fingernail. Every man on the line had the same thought and none of them said it. We did not look. We did not look. We did not look. Above them, the station turned slowly until the docking cradle presented its black square to the thin sky. The cradle took the weight the way a hand takes a book it has been waiting to read since childhood. Guides extended like tongues, felt along the box's edges, found nothing bright, decided it liked what it found anyway. Interfaces met with a click whose echo lasted much longer than the sound. The cradle slid the box inward on pads that did not exist for the purpose of anything else. The air changed inside the station. There are little weathers even in dead places. This one took on the smell of struck metal. Men unhooked cables with hands that had done the same movement in practice until the movement and the hand had become the same thing. They backed away from the threshold as one backs away from someone sleeping who must not be woken. The box went on alone, drawn by mag rails that did not sing because their music had been taken from them during design. Between the cradle and the inner shell, the station kept a corridor 1,000 meters long. There were no corners in this corridor. Corners invite light to consider itself as angles. The floor fell an imperceptible degree thus and rose a degree thus, so that a man walking it would find himself drifting between tiny declines and ascents and forget the mean of either, and when he stopped, he would not be certain whether he had been going up or down. The box travelled it without noticing. The corridor led to a seam that had been cut once and would not know how to be cut again. The seam grew as the box approached and then remembered itself and became a seam no longer. Thol walked in the dark beside it, counting under his breath without numbers. He had an old habit of placing his palm on plates as they slid by. He did not learn anything from the plates. The plates learned something from him. They learned what a hand feels like when it refuses to forget what it touched. At the threshold to the cube, wards that had been drawn by people who did not believe in wards glowed the way coals do when breath wakes them. Their glow was not light. It was intent made visible. Tyrell stood there and considered the sum of the days since the field, and found a remainder that felt like a life he would not have. He stepped aside. He let the machine be the thing in the room that gave the last word. The box entered the cube. If there was an echo, It died of embarrassment the instant it was born. The rails decoupled themselves and went away, ashamed to be metal in a room that had learned to be something else. Seals engaged. Gases that did not contain air but pretended to for the sake of the men listening hissed through valves and settled where gas likes to live. The seam became a wall again. Locks turned themselves and then, in an act of grace, forgot they had ever been locks. Outside the cube, things remembered how to breathe. Pressure found its pressures. The long corridor released the sense of tilt it had held and became honest about its flatness. Men took hands off railings and realized their palms had sweated and said nothing to anyone about it. Thol stood still a long time with his head bowed as if counting might change a number that does not change. Tyrell looked at a panel that did not say sealed and did not say safe and said only ready because men were the ones who wrote safe on things, and that was why they died. The work did not end because a box had been moved from a world to a room. The next labor had no weight to lift. It was the purge. Doctrine left the station like a slow wind and crossed the sector. Artificers were told to dull every lens. Libraries learned how to burn quietly. Voxnets lost their old songs and found static that behaved itself. Acutely, quietly, hundreds of archives died with a small noise like a mouse behind a wall. On ships in harbours far from the pale halo, a junior adept went to index a file and found a space where a title had been and thought of sleep for the first time in a week, and went and lay down on a cot and did not dream. Fathers began to warn sons about polished helmets. Mothers took the mirrors from their daughters' rooms and told them it was modesty. Priests found a saint with no face and gave it a litany that had the good manners not to describe anything. The world took blindness as a kind of wisdom and wore it until it fitted. On the 7th day after arrival, Thol and Tyrell stood once more before the seam that would not admit it was a seam. There is always ceremony, even when ceremony insists it is only procedure. The men with them carried nothing that could reflect. Their boots were wrapped in cloth, their mouths carried words and used none of them. The key to the cube was a cylinder of old alloy, cut with a pattern a blind hand had followed at a bench miles and years away. Tyrell touched it to the plate of the wall. The wall felt it the way an old dog feels the hand of a familiar, and some part of it softened. Tyrell turned the key 3 times. The key decided to be used once. It forgot what a cylinder was, the way some men forget what it is to be young. In its hollow went a coil of soft grey powder that hissed and became a small river that found a channel and ran into it and did not leave. No words asked for mercy or thanked anyone. A job had been done. Between the walls, within the walls, nothing moved. That was what the men had built, a place where moving would have to learn a new name if it dared to try. On the glass of the ash world, wind drew an old map, and then a newer one. Then both maps were dappled by a fall of fine white, a rain the sky had forgotten how to keep for itself. In orbit, the station found a cadence. It turned once each 5 hours so that its shade fell across the burned land as a square. The square moved like the face of a clock a child has drawn for himself. Men began to use it to count. In the deep of the cube, where even counting goes dim, a small sound woke and slept and woke again, at intervals that did not keep faith with the station's turning. Not a scream, not yet. Something a little larger than breath and a little smaller than hope. A shift of weight, the faintest scrape. A low, tired sob that had forgotten what it was about and had kept on out of habit. Outside, men wrote it down without writing it. They learned its rhythm with the soles of their feet and the hairs on their forearms, and the way their hearts waited when the hour was near. Even the metal learned. The walls took the sound and ate as much of it as they could, and left a thread for the men to hold. The men held it and did not speak. Work continued, because work is the only answer to endings worth anything. The doctrine walked new routes across the maps of a dozen worlds, and every place it went a rumor sprouted and put out leaves. A saint whose face must not be painted, a shrine where the poor go to leave their mirrors, a fortress that never lights a candle. Tyrell and Thol watched those leaves from a distance and decided to let them grow. Fear disguised as reverence is still a rope you can pull when you need to bend a crowd's will. The pale halo kept its appointment with itself. The ships in their ellipses were insects compared to the scale of quiet. The box within the box within the box learned the shape of the thing it held, and the thing learned the shape of the room, and the room learned patience the way water learns depth. When the first month turned, a maintenance team passed along the rim of the inner shell on hands and knees because the passage had been built to discourage walking. One of them paused, palm flat to the wall, and felt a pulse that was not machinery. He forgot to breathe for a count of 2. Behind him, another hand tapped his boot heel to ask if the route was clear. He lifted his hand. He crawled onward. The wall cooled under the absence of touch, and remembered nothing. It was a good wall. The crane on the surface stood empty. The tracks in the glass that had carried the weight had filled with dust. If a man had stood there and placed his ear to the ground, he would have heard nothing but wind traveling with a secret in its pockets. No men would stand there again, and in orbit, the transport that had carried the sarcophagus from world to cube drifted away on a vector that would end near a shipyard where things that are not meant to remember come to have their memories changed. The crew cleaned their decks. They untied cloth from their boots. They took the wax from their ears and threw it into the slop and watched it float and imagined it had voices trapped in it. They were wrong and they were right. The first part of the work was done. The box had been placed inside the larger box, and the doctrine was on the move. And in the dark where men do not go, the small sound learned patience it did not need. Because patience is for creatures who make choices, and this thing had one choice, and it would take it when a world far away did the wrong thing at the right time, and a machine a child had forgotten to decommission drew a rectangle of light upon its face and gave it back the only gift the universe has ever offered it that it can recognize. For now, the pale halo turned without complaint, and the men below it slept in a light that did not show them their own faces when they woke. Centuries soften even the sharpest edges. The dead world turned beneath its ring of iron prayers until wind carved the glass into dunes again, and the dunes learned to move. In that patient sky, Sanctum Absolum drifted like a black tooth set in a jaw of stars. Time had taught the fortress to speak in fewer noises, the tick of cooling plates, the long sigh of recyclers, the faint tremor of engines that had forgotten the difference between waiting and worship. Pilgrims came blindfolded, led by the Order of the Veiled Hand. They pressed palms to dull walls and left the heat of their skin as offerings. They carried mirrors wrapped in cloth and unwrapped them one by one to break them under heel. In the nave they sang songs that did not name the subject, only circled it the way birds circle a well. The Saint of Silence blessed them in absentee, a myth with no face, and therefore as large as any fear a man could carry to it. The wardens were blind by oath and by needle. Their corridors were measured in steps and knocks, their scriptures in taps along a rail. They did not guard a shrine so much as a subtraction. Far below their footfalls, nested in 9 shells of unlight, the cube endured. The air within did not circulate. The floor remembered weight without telling anyone. On the 791st year of containment, a maintenance audit found a thing it could not reconcile with itself. Adept archivist Faron Kai, thin, patient, with augmetics that hummed like bees under bone, followed a thread of checksum anomalies down into a warm pocket of the station's memory where an older logic had once nested. There he found a coil sealed in resin and bound with a strip of unknown parchment. The strip had been inscribed in a language his implants refused to translate. He peeled the resin away with tools that did not reflect and placed the coil upon a reader that had been made ignorant on purpose. The coil did not show an image. It did not even admit to containing one. It exhaled a hiss the reader called noise, and the voxnet called idle, and the adepts who had lived long enough to learn superstition called breath. Faron Kai logged it, quarantined it, then came back at an hour when the monastery slept. His hands did not shake. Curiosity was a habit he had never successfully unlearned. He taught the coil to speak a little more. The hiss gained a grain to it, a pattern, an almost rhythm, like a heart built out of static, like the sound a throat makes when it has forgotten speech but not feeling. He leaned closer without meaning to, as men do when they listen for rain. Down below the shells, in the chamber that had been taught to contain verbs, something shifted its weight the smallest imaginable distance and stopped. The coil's hiss walked the corridors the way incense walks stone. It curled under doors and laid itself in the bowls of blind ears. Monks paused mid-psalm and tilted their heads, and what they heard was not sound, but permission. Word moved through the dormitories that the saint was singing. Pilgrims knelt and pressed the cloth of their blindfolds tighter and swayed, because swaying is a way to agree with a thing too big to be argued with. Choirs rose where no choir time had been scheduled, the nave filled with voices that could not know they carried a wire. Sanctum Absolum changed sound. The tick of the plates took on company. Runes in sub-basements deep as old shame lit once, faintly, then died as if embarrassed. The station's heart turned a degree towards something that was not a direction and held there. Beyond the honest vacuum, ships felt it without knowing what it was. A navigator in a far system lifted her veil and stared into a warp that, for one beat, had nothing to say. On a black ship between wars, a librarian of the Black Legion woke from a dream in which a white figure ran through walls and left corridors full of quiet. He sat up with his mouth open and no sound came out. Word-bearer apostates casting lots in a ruin felt their knuckle bones return the same throw 5 times in a row and began to preach with a steadier joy. On a noise barge dedicated to mirthlessness, the musician stopped in the middle of a scream to listen for a better key and did not find one. The Ruinous Powers do not attend to mortals in the way mortals think of attention. They attend to patterns, to tears, to symmetries broken in interesting places. This was interesting. It was a shape that belonged to flesh but not to desire, to grief but not to prayer. It was a line that pointed only forward and an ending that never learned to become a lesson. The architect of fate tilted one head among his countless and found the lines between cause and hunger, knotting in a way that could be made into a bird or a blade. The Lord of Skulls brushed one finger across the smear and heard only forward, 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 and smiled because it sounded like killing even when no one held a weapon. The Prince of Excess leaned in and found no music to taste, and yet an ache so pure it might be made into an instrument, and laughed. Grandfather counted the seconds between the tiny breaths and found an inevitability he could love. On a distant shrine world, a sorcerer in the colours of a rumour lifted a hand and drew 3 curves in air that should not have held them. The curves became a course. Enginarium bells rang of their own accord. Warbands that had been content to circle their own appetites found their bows bending toward a thin, lightless place above a thin, glassless world. In message crypts that prided themselves on being incestuous and mean, a phrase began to breed. The saint that screams without wanting to, the mouth that makes no covenant, the thing that obeys a rule older than their fever. In the monastery, Feron Kai did not see any of this. He saw a graph stutter and flatten, a line climb by less than a tick, a coil that yielded a new shard of something that might have been data if data loved men back. He closed his eyes because eyes were a liability here and listened the way a child listens at a door. The sound in the coil had reassembled itself. There was a depth to it now, a chamber behind it where echoes might go if they were invited. It was small. It was human. It had no mercy in it because mercy is a choice, and this thing did not own choices, only obedience. In the cube, hands that had covered a face for centuries trembled through a fraction of a degree. Fingertips rasped skin. There was no light to be reflected by them. Pressure tightened around the bones of the room and eased. Feron Kai shut the reader down. The hiss did not notice. It bled into the rails, found the old lines the purge had missed, remembered the shapes of rooms that had loved light and forgot them again. He filed the coil under lock and went to Turel's old pulpit and wrote a single-line request without ornaments, permission to burn what remains of everything. The Order of the Veiled Hand did not always receive orders. It received habits, and it was happy. The habit it received now was a movement like closing a fist around a coal before it can teach a house how to be warm. Blind wardens moved along corridors and placed hands on the locks they had never seen. Air pumps choked long and slow and then learned silence again. The station inclined itself a single degree toward the star with the sparser flares. Sleepers woke without knowing why and clutched their blindfolds tighter and told themselves they had woken to pray. Feron Kai pulled the lever. Heat strode the corridors. The monastery brightened the way a face brightens before it breaks and then held steady. Panels shuddered as seals boiled out of their grooves and became smoke. The Order of the Veiled Hand led the last of the pilgrims across the thresholds to ships that would not carry mirrors. In the nave, the hymn ended because someone forgot the shape of its next note, and the rest quietly agreed. Deep within the shells, the cube learned what heat feels like when it refuses to carry light. The floor bowed by less than a hair. Hands tightened against skin. A foot found the beginning of a motion that had been held still for a very long time. Something that has only ever obeyed one law remembered that the law is only a rule so long as the world that wrote it keeps its eyes closed. The furnaces opened, the station bloomed. In the dark between shells, shadows writhed and then became themselves again. A pulse went out like the ring in a pond when a stone chooses. It crossed the thin atmosphere and struck the fleet that had been listening. The men aboard those ships forgot, for a heartbeat, what victory meant and why they had ever loved it. In the cube, the breath became a whimper, and the whimper became a breath again. And then, with the inevitability of a tide when there is still a moon, the breath became a beginning. Sanctum Absolum burned clean. The doctrine went out into the sector and farther. The transports lit their engines and pulled away, each carrying a litany it dared not speak aloud. The ring of iron prayers cracked, but did not shatter. The star received what had been offered and did not comment. Ships far away changed course without announcing it. Cults drew circles on floors that had once known better. A librarian in black armor smiled like a wound learning a new mouth. The world that had been glassed remembered how to hold footprints again because dust does not honor history. The cube held what it held. Somewhere a child looked into a spoon and laughed at the strange face he found there and showed it to his sister. In the dark that has endured, a figure stood. It inhaled. The station's carcass drifted through its own smoke. The transports climbed. The pilgrim songs thinned and went quiet as the engines took over. The Ruinous Powers leaned closer, as close as hunger ever gets. Deep in the box, something placed one foot in front of the other and learned, again, what a corridor feels like when it breaks to let a body through. Far away, on no map, the warp wind rose like a crowd before a door. In the outer dark, a fleet that should have been elsewhere failed to remember why elsewhere had mattered. Its pilots plotted a vector that would carry them along the pale halo's ecliptic like carrion birds, learning choreography. Sorcery tracked where mathematics had forgotten to be fun. Signals crawled inward from the sector's rim. Relays burped back to life after long, honest deaths. In a lower hive, a child with a stolen vox string strummed his fingers on it to hear a tone, and heard instead a sigh and began to cry because he was 4, and no one had taught him how to name an ache that large. A heretic chorus on a derelict began recording silence because it had more markings in it than their catalogues of screams. Elsewhere, an astropath vomited light and apologized to nobody. Feron Kai stood before the seal that had ceased to admit to being a seal and placed his palm against it. He tapped a pattern that meant farewell in a language the Order kept hidden in the bones of its hands. Somewhere far out in the ring, a panel clicked, and a circuit cut, and a small lamp stopped lying to itself. He walked the long corridor that made men forget which way was up and stopped at the casket of old decisions, the one that had held the kill script for a station he would never pilot out of here again. He ran his fingers along the raised letters in case knowing their shape would qualify as understanding. Then he keyed the sequence that would open the furnaces like mouths. The monastery began to warm in the wrong places. Ducts long asleep tasted ion and learned to hum again. Pilgrims were led gently by the hand to transports, blind, bewildered, calm, the way children are calm when the adult voice uses the right tone. The Order sang in monotone to keep them from hearing the change in the station's breath. Metal groaned as if setting shoulders. The hull looked inward at itself the way a man looks inward 1 hour before he makes a decision he cannot unmake. Across the void, 3 ships bearing heretical sigils cut their engines and drifted to listen. They were the ears of something larger. On their decks, men and not men stood very still because even depravity learns reverence when the pattern is strong enough. They had come for a miracle they did not deserve. They were going to get one anyway. Feron Kai sent the Doctrine of Forgetting on a band the sect had saved for suicides and saints. It went out without music. It crossed the network like a shadow crosses a field at noon. It told satellites to turn their faces to the wall. It taught archives how to unlearn the pleasure of being useful. It asked librarians to go to sleep and see if they woke smaller. It touched a bell in a cathedral that knew no God and made it ring once, not for mourning but for instruction. He stood at the pulpit and set his other hand upon the lever that would bring the furnaces into the heart of the ring and watched the pale star through a viewport shaped like a prayer left unfinished. The fortress turned to present its sacrament to the sun. In the cube, the smallest part of a sob escaped a throat that had done nothing else in all the years it had been permitted to exist. It was not loud. It found every path anyway. The Ruinous Powers crowded close in the only way they understand closeness. Korn's laugh travelled the long way round because he prefers the echo. Zinch rearranged 3 possibilities to see which one tasted like regret. Slanesh leaned on the rail because the absence of music is a kind of note. Nurgle opened his arms to an inevitability, ready to call it family whatever it did. On a mining rock 2 systems over, a bored overseer scrolled an old roster to kill an hour. A thumbnail that had never existed flickered alive in the margin and went dead again. He did not know he had seen it. He rubbed his eyes because the grit was bad today, and went back to adding up names that never stayed the same number.